The amphitheater on Zenith Prime buzzed with anticipation as the most influential figures of the Galactic Union gathered to witness the grand demonstration. Towering banners displaying the Union's insignia fluttered in the artificial breeze, and the massive dome overhead provided a breathtaking view of the stars beyond. At the center of the grand stage stood High Admiral, his bioluminescent skin pulsing with confidence as he raised a hand to quiet the murmuring crowd. Scientists, military officials, and diplomats from dozens of species leaned forward in their seats, eager to witness what had been heralded as the greatest breakthrough in defensive technology in centuries. Before them, a translucent energy dome hummed with power, its shifting blue glow casting eerie reflections across the polished floors. It was the culmination of decades of research, a shield so advanced that it could render entire fleets immune to enemy fire. Plasma, explosives, nothing could breach its impenetrable layers of kinetic and fields. The Union had declared this the ultimate defense, a technology that would solidify their dominance for generations to come. Deep voice echoed across the amphitheater, amplified by unseen speakers. Behold, the future of warfare. A shield that no known weapon can penetrate, no force can overcome. The Galactic Union is now untouchable. He gestured toward a row of automated turrets, each loaded with progressively more powerful weapons. Observe as we test its strength against the mightiest arms of the galaxy. The first test commenced. A plasma rifle fired, the bright bolt of energy slamming into the shield, only to be absorbed harmlessly, the energy dispersing in a harmless ripple. Next, fired a hypervelocity slug. It struck with a deafening crack but failed to penetrate, the projector vanishing into the glowing barrier like a pebble sinking into water. The audience murmured in admiration, nodding in approval as one test after another confirmed the shield's invincibility. Then a voice rang out, cutting through the atmosphere. Mind if we give it a shot? Heads turned toward the small group of humans standing near the back. Among them was Captain Daniel Reeves, a veteran officer with sharp blue eyes and a posture that exuded quiet confidence. He stepped forward, holding a small, antiquated weapon, a simple 9mm handgun. The sight of the primitive firearm drew scattered laughter from the crowd. A few Union officers exchanged amused glances, seeing it as nothing more than a human attempt at humor. High Admiral smirked, clearly indulging in the absurdity of the situation. By all means, Captain. If it will satisfy your curiosity. Reeves said nothing. He simply lifted the handgun, took careful aim, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the gunshot rang out, a sharp, almost insignificant sound compared to the powerful blasts from earlier. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, an ear-splitting shatter split the silence as the shimmering blue dome fractured like fragile glass. Glowing shards of energy flickered and dissipated into nothingness, leaving only stunned silence in their wake. Gasps erupted throughout the amphitheater. Scientists scrambled toward the ruined shield generator, scanning it frantically. Smirk vanished, replaced by a stunned expression as he stared at the spot where the impenetrable shield had once stood. Reeves holstered his pistol and shrugged. Guess it wasn't so untouchable after all. Panic rippled through the amphitheater as the implications of what had just happened began to sink in. Scientists swarmed the disabled shield generator, their tendrils and mechanical appendages scanning, prodding, and analyzing every component as they searched for an explanation. The murmur of confused voices grew louder, a chaotic mix of disbelief and desperate rationalization. High Admiral stood frozen, his bioluminescent markings dimming as shock coursed through his system. He had expected a flawless demonstration, an event that would cement the Galactic Union's technological superiority. Instead, he had just watched their most prized defensive breakthrough crumble under the force of a primitive human firearm. Captain Daniel Reeves remained where he stood, arms crossed as he observed the growing chaos with an expression of mild amusement. The other human delegates exchanged knowing glances, resisting the urge to smirk. Reeves hadn't come here to humiliate the Union, but he had suspected their arrogance would be their downfall. The so-called impenetrable shield had been designed to counter projectors, dispersing plasma blasts and slugs with sophisticated energy fields. But in their pursuit of absolute defense, the Union scientists had overlooked something simple: kinetic impacts. A scientist with deep crimson scales and mechanical eyepieces turned to his was frantic. "Admiral, the shield's integrity was not compromised by an energy overload or a projector. It simply failed." "Failed?" snapped. His deep voice laced with disbelief. "How does the most advanced shielding system in the galaxy fail against a slug thrower?" The scientist hesitated, exchanging a quick glance with his colleagues before responding. "The system was never designed to register projectors as a threat. It prioritizes discharges an extreme kinetic force, dispersing them across the energy field's matrix. The bullet, it moved too slowly, with too little mass. The shield didn't even recognize it as an attack." Silence hung heavy in the air as the realization dawned on them. The shield hadn't been destroyed, it had simply allowed the bullet to pass through, completely unchallenged. All of their sophisticated calculations, decades of research, and technological advancements had been undone by an oversight so fundamental it bordered on absurd. Reeves cleared his throat, drawing all eyes back to him. "If it helps, this isn't the first time we've seen something like this. Humans used to develop similar defenses, force fields, energy shields, all that fancy tech. But we learned a long time ago that sometimes, the best way around something isn't brute force." He tacked his pistol. "Sometimes, the simplest tool does the job." Mandibles clicked in frustration. "This is impossible. You are saying that all of our defenses, our entire military doctrine, could be compromised by bullets?" Reeves shrugged. "Not just bullets. Knives, arrows, maybe even a rock if you're lucky." A ripple of horror spread through the gathered officials. If what Reeves was saying was true, then every fleet, every planetary defense system, every strategic plan built around the shield's invincibility was now worthless. The Galactic Union had poured immense resources into this project, believing it to be the ultimate safeguard. And now, in front of representatives from every major power, they had been exposed as vulnerable. A deep, resonant growl echoed from the amphitheater's upper levels. Ambassador of the Dominion, a species of towering warriors, leaned forward in his seat, his crimson eyes gleaming with interest. "So the mighty Galactic Union, with all its technology, can be undone by mere primitives with projector weapons? How fascinating." Turned sharply, his bioluminescence flaring as he realized the greater threat unfolding before him. The Union's rivals had been watching closely, and now they had seen weakness. This demonstration had not only failed, it had exposed a fatal flaw to the entire galaxy. One of the human delegates, a woman with hair and a calculating gaze, stepped forward. "Admiral," she said smoothly, "it seems you have a problem. But the good news? We can help." Mandibles twitched. "Help?" Reeves smiled, his voice casual but firm. "Humans have spent centuries refining all kinds of warfare. We know a thing or two about plugging gaps in a defense system. Maybe it's time we had a conversation about tactical collaboration." She did, knowing full well what was happening. The humans had just maneuvered themselves into the perfect position, not as enemies, but as indispensable allies. He could either refuse their help and risk losing the Union's strategic dominance, or accept their expertise and let humans influence their military doctrine. And judging by the interested looks from other species in the room, the humans were no longer the ones on the back foot. The council chamber was filled with a tense, suffocating silence. Stood rigid at the head of the table, his claws digging into the polished surface as he stared at the holographic display flickering before him. It was undeniable. Every simulation, every recalibration of the shield matrix, all pointed to the same inescapable truth. The perfect defense they had so proudly boasted about was nothing more than an illusion. The simplest, most primitive form of weaponry had bypassed it with ease, reducing centuries of research and technological advancement to little more than an expensive mistake. Across the room, the human delegation sat in calm, composed silence, watching the turmoil unfold with practiced patience. Captain Daniel Reeves leaned back in his chair, his fingers idly drumming against the armrest as he observed the officials of the Galactic Union descend into hushed, frantic discussions. The implications of this failure were catastrophic. If the shield technology was as vulnerable as the humans had proven it to be, then entire fleets, planetary defenses, and critical strongholds were now exposed. One of the engineers, a scientist, slammed his appendages onto the table, his voice laced with panic. "This is unacceptable. There must be a recalibration method, some way to adjust the shield's parameters to detect projectors." Another scientist, a reptilian, let out a frustrated hiss. "We designed it to counter weaponry. Our defenses have been built upon the principle that combat is superior. The Union has spent centuries rendering obsolete. We never thought to account for." He gestured angrily toward Reeves' pistol. This exhaled slowly, his bioluminescent markings pulsing in a steady rhythm as he composed himself. His pride, his years of military service, all screamed at him to dismiss this as an anomaly. But he couldn't. Not when the evidence was so damning. His gaze shifted toward Reeves, his mandibles clicking in irritation. "Captain Reeves." His voice was measured, restrained. "You knew this would happen. You came here fully aware that your weapon would bypass our shields." Reeves shrugged, his expression neutral. "Had a pretty good hunch." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Look, Admiral. We're not here to embarrass you. We're here to help you." "Stiffened. Help?" "Yes." Reeves gestured toward the display. "You built your entire doctrine around energy weapons. Plasma rifles, directed particle beams, you name it. And sure, against most species, that works fine. But you made the mistake of thinking your technology was the only way forward. You ignored simple physics, overlooked centuries of combat experience, and now you're paying the price." He folded his arms. "Humans? We don't underestimate anything. We prepare for every possibility. That's why we still use. That's why we still train with swords, knives, and even combat. Because the moment you decide there's only one way to fight a war, you set yourself up for failure." The room fell silent again, but this time, the tension had shifted. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by grim realization. Exchanged a glance with his officers, their expressions mirroring his own conflicted thoughts. The humans weren't wrong. Their arrogance had blinded them, made them believe that technological superiority alone was enough. A sharp chime cut through the air as one of the consoles lit up. An officer, his uniform crisp but his posture rigid with unease, turned to "Admiral, we have a situation." Eyes narrowed. "Report." The officer hesitated before speaking. "Encrypted communications from the Dominion and the War Clans. They were watching the demonstration." His voice wavered slightly. "They're demanding answers." Murmurs rippled through the room. Reeves raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess. They just realized they've been planning their entire military strategy around fighting something that's not as invincible as they thought." Mandibles tightened. The and the were two of the Union's most powerful rivals, both kept at bay largely because of the technological gap between them and the Union's superior defenses. Now, with that illusion shattered, the balance of power had shifted. It wouldn't be long before the vultures started circling, testing the Union's weaknesses, probing for any advantage. Clenched his fists. There was no escaping it. He turned his gaze back to Reeves, his pride warring with the stark reality of the situation. "You said you could help." Reeves nodded. "I did." The Admiral exhaled slowly. "What do you want in return?" Reeves smiled, but there was steel behind it. "A seat at the table." He leaned forward, his voice unwavering. "Equal standing in military collaboration, full access to technological exchanges, and a say in strategic planning. No more treating humanity as an afterthought. Bioluminescence flickered erratically as he processed the demand. This wasn't just about fixing their shields. This was about reshaping the balance of power entirely. Giving humanity a seat at the table meant acknowledging them as equals, as necessary. It meant that the Galactic Union would have to rely on them not just as allies, but as advisors in military matters. And yet, could he afford to refuse? A long silence stretched between them before, finally inclined his head. You will have your seat, Captain Reeves. His voice was quiet, but firm. But understand this, if you humans overstep your bounds, if you attempt to leverage this situation for dominance, there will be consequences. The War Council chamber was deathly silent. Officials from across the Galactic Union sat in tense anticipation, their expressions betraying a mixture of fear and uncertainty. Admiral stood at the head of the table, his claws drumming against the polished surface as he studied the data displayed before him. The holographic projection detailed the latest reports from the Boasted skirmishes. Enemy fleets had already begun testing their defenses, and the results were disastrous. The energy shields were failing at an alarming rate, bypassed with nothing more than primitive ballistic weaponry. Worlds once thought secure were now vulnerable, and centuries of military doctrine were crumbling before their very eyes. Across from, Captain Daniel Reeves and his human advisors sat calmly, their expressions unreadable. And like the other delegates, they weren't panicking. They weren't frozen in fear. If anything, Reeves looked expectant, as if he had known this moment would come. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and let the silence stretch for a moment before finally speaking. It's worse than you thought, isn't it? His voice was steady, almost casual, but it cut through the room like a blade. Mandibles clicked in irritation, but he didn't deny it. We've already lost 2 outposts along the Boasted, he admitted, his bioluminescent markings dim with frustration. A third is under siege as we speak. Our fleet is struggling to adapt. The enemy has abandoned combat entirely and switched to kinetic weapons. Mass drivers, even crude chemically propelled slugs. Our shields are failing against them. He exhaled sharply. This is your fault, human. Reeves smirked. My fault? All I did was show you the truth. You're the ones who ignored the possibility that your defenses weren't as perfect as you thought. He gestured toward the reports. This was inevitable. If it wasn't us, someone else would have figured it out eventually. Be thankful we're on your side. One of the alien generals, a towering being named, slammed his clawed fist against the table. Then tell us, human, how do we counter this? His mandibles twitched in frustration. How do we stop our enemies from exploiting this weakness? Reeves exchanged a glance with a woman named Colonel Vasquez. She gave him a knowing nod. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Reeves leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. You don't, he said simply. Not with your current fleet. Outrage rippled through the room. Bioluminescence flared bright red. You dare suggest we abandon our fleets? Our way of war? Reeves held up a hand. Not abandon. Adapt. His expression turned serious as he leaned forward. Your ships are built for energy warfare. They're sleek, fast, optimized for engagements. That worked against enemies who fought the same way. But against kinetic weaponry, you're bringing a knife to a gunfight. Reeves activated his own holographic display, revealing schematics of a heavily armed warship unlike anything in the Union's current fleet. This warships, thick armor plating instead of energy shielding, rotary cannons, turrets that can intercept ballistic projectors before they reach you, that can punch through enemy hulls before they even get close. He pointed at the design. You need to stop thinking like warriors and start thinking like us. Narrowed his multifaceted eyes. And how long would it take to retrofit our fleets for this warfare? Vasquez answered this time. Too long, she admitted. Which is why you need us on the front lines now. We already have the experience. Our fleets are already designed for kinetic combat. The best way to stop your enemies from exploiting your weakness is to let us fight them while you adapt. Murmurs spread throughout the council. Clenched his fists, turned between his pride and the reality before him. The Union had always viewed humanity as an auxiliary force, useful but not essential. Now, they were faced with an undeniable truth. Without human military expertise, they were doomed. A sleek, alien named, one of the more pragmatic members of the council, finally spoke. If we were to accept your proposal, what are your terms? Reeves' smirk returned. Equal standing, he said. No more treating us like a junior partner. Humanity gets full participation in military. Joint command of fleets. Full access to all technological exchanges. His eyes hardened. You need us. We know it. And we're not going to fight your war for free. Claws dug into the table. This was it. The moment he had feared. The moment humanity stopped being a minor player and became a true power in the galaxy. If he agreed to this, the balance of power in the Union would shift forever. But if he refused, then the Union would fall, and every world and in its protection would burn. Reeves extended his hand, hesitated for a moment before clasping it in a firm shake. It was done.